In March 1967, something happened at a U.S. Air Force missile complex in Montana that would become one of the most persistent UFO stories of the Cold War. 10 nuclear missiles suddenly went offline. The missiles were part of America's strategic nuclear deterrent, buried in hardened launch facilities across the Montana landscape. And according to later accounts from former Air Force personnel, unidentified objects had been reported near some of those facilities at roughly the same time. That much sounds like the beginning of a familiar UFO story. But there is a problem. The famous version of this case does not actually begin with a pilot seeing gray aliens. There is no reliable historical record establishing that a pilot witnessed extraterrestrial beings over Montana in 1967. The surviving and later published accounts instead concern Air Force missile crews, security personnel, maintenance personnel, and unidentified lights or objects near nuclear missile facilities. The most important incident occurred at Echo Flight on March 16, 1967, a separate and more controversial account involving former missile officer Robert Salas concerns another missile facility and is generally dated to March 24 to 25, and that distinction matters. Because once you remove the parts that cannot be established, something genuinely strange is still left behind. 10 missiles, a Cold War nuclear base, an unexplained technical failure, reports of unidentified objects, and a military investigation that was serious enough to trigger concern at the highest levels of the Strategic Air Command. The question is not simply whether aliens were there. The more difficult question is this: what actually happened inside the missile system that morning? And why did the story become so much more complicated decades later? The story begins beneath the ground. In 1967, the United States and Soviet Union were living under the logic of mutually assured destruction. The nuclear weapons scattered across the American Midwest and Northern Plains were not theoretical. They were operational. Minuteman missiles could be kept on alert, ready for launch. If the order ever came, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana was part of that system. The base supported hundreds of Minuteman missiles distributed across remote launch facilities. The missiles were separated geographically, but connected through a sophisticated command and control network. The men operating that system were not UFO hunters. They were missile officers. Their job was to make sure the weapons worked. Routine mattered, procedure mattered, a warning mattered, an unexpected aircraft might matter, a technical fault mattered enormously. Anything that could interfere with the nuclear command system had to be investigated. That is why March 16, 1967, remains so interesting. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, according to the later released Air Force historical record, all 10 missiles assigned to Echo Flight went into a no-go condition. 10, not 1, not 2, all 10. The official history describes the launch facilities as losing strategic alert status nearly simultaneously. A later Strategic Air Command message characterized the loss of strategic alert as occurring within roughly 10 seconds and described it as a cause for grave concern. Imagine being underground, responsible for nuclear missiles, and suddenly watching the system report failure after failure. One missile drops off alert, then another, then another, then the rest, and there is no obvious explanation. This is the first mystery. Not aliens, not flying saucers, the missiles. What could cause 10 independent weapons systems to become unavailable almost simultaneously? That was the problem the Air Force had to solve. Initially, the investigation appears to have been exactly what you would expect from a military organization confronted with a potentially catastrophic technical failure. Maintenance personnel were dispatched, engineers examined the system. The problem was investigated at the base and later with assistance from defense contractors. The surviving records indicate that the shutdown involved an electrical or electronic signal entering the missile command system, but identifying the mechanism that produced the failure was not the same as identifying its ultimate source. The official history is relatively restrained. It records the missile shutdown, it records the investigation, and it addresses rumors that unidentified flying objects had been present around Echo Flight. But the official account did not accept the UFO explanation. The historical record states that rumors of UFOs around Echo Flight were investigated and considered disproven. A mobile strike team reportedly observed no unusual activity or UFOs. Years later, former Air Force personnel began describing something different. One of the most important names is Robert Salas. He had been inside the nuclear command system, Decades after the events, he described receiving a telephone call from a security controller above ground. According to Salas, security personnel had noticed strange lights moving in the sky. Later, they reportedly described a reddish or orange pulsating object hovering near the facility while the missiles began going offline. That is a remarkable claim. But there is an important complication. The chronology of Salas's account changed over time. His original recollections placed him at one flight designation, while later research moved the incident to Oscar flight. The dates and locations have also been reconstructed differently in different accounts. The strongest documentary evidence proves that 10 missiles actually did go offline. The UFO connection, however, remains a disputed interpretation. Investigators later reproduced aspects of the malfunction by introducing an electrical pulse into a data line. This suggested that an electronic signal could affect the missile system. The question then became, where had the pulse come from? A missile system does not need an extraterrestrial visitor to fail. It needs electricity, signals, wiring, logic, redundancy, and a failure somewhere in that chain. Later discussions introduced possibilities such as electromagnetic interference, classified military technology, natural phenomena, or simple technical vulnerabilities. Skeptics also suggested that some reported lights may have been astronomical objects such as Mars. The official evidence establishes the missile malfunction. Witness accounts establish that some personnel later associated unusual aerial observations with it, but the evidence does not establish a causal connection between the two. As the years passed, the incident grew into a famous UFO legend. Books, documentaries, conferences, and witness recollections expanded the story. However, there is no reliable contemporary record establishing that a pilot encountered gray extraterrestrials at Malmstrom in 1967. There is no verified alien body, authenticated photograph, confirmed biological sample, or independently authenticated recording proving extraterrestrial involvement. When all unsupported claims are removed, the documented mystery remains compelling. A real nuclear missile shutdown occurred. A real military investigation followed. Real witnesses reported unusual aerial observations. The official record did not conclude that UFOs caused the malfunction, and decades later former personnel offered accounts that challenged the official interpretation. The central unanswered question is still the same. What happened inside those missile systems, and what, if anything, was happening in the sky above them? The Air Force investigation did not simply shrug and walk away. The missile system was examined. Testing was performed. Engineers attempted to reproduce the failure. The surviving case record says that researchers were able to reproduce aspects of the malfunction by introducing an electrical pulse into a data line. That is important, because it moves the mystery away from something supernatural and into the realm of engineering. An electronic pulse could affect the system, but where had the pulse come from? That question is much less dramatic than did aliens shut down nuclear missiles. It is also much more defensible, because a missile system does not need an extraterrestrial visitor to fail. It needs electricity, signals, wiring, logic, redundancy, and a failure somewhere in that chain. The difficulty was that 10 missiles apparently lost strategic alert status almost together, so investigators were faced with a problem of scale. A single component could fail, a single missile could fail, but 10? That suggested either a common point of vulnerability or an external event capable of affecting multiple systems. And that is where electromagnetic interference enters the story. Later accounts of the investigation described an electrical pulse as a possible way to reproduce the observed failure mode. An electromagnetic disturbance can, in principle, affect electronics. That does not mean a UFO caused the event. It means there was a technical pathway by which something external could potentially influence the missile control system. And suddenly, the mystery changes, because now the question becomes, could the Air Force have encountered some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon? A weapon? An accident? Environmental interference? A technical vulnerability? Or simply a failure whose cause remained unidentified? There is another complication. The March 16 Echo flight incident is not identical to the later story told by Robert Salas. The official record clearly documents Echo flight. Salas's later account concerns another flight. This distinction is sometimes lost when the story is retold. Two incidents become one. Two timelines become one. Two sets of witnesses become one dramatic event. And once that happens, the story becomes easier to tell but harder to investigate. So let's slow down. March 16th, Echo flight. 10 missiles. No-go conditions. That is the documented core. Then there are reports and later testimony concerning unidentified objects. And then there is the separate account involving Salas and another missile facility. The temptation is to connect everything, but an investigation should do the opposite. It should separate the pieces, because if the pieces still connect after being separated, the connection becomes more meaningful. The Air Force's own record is especially interesting here. The incident was important enough to generate an investigation and communications within the Strategic Air Command. The loss of strategic alert across 10 missiles was not treated as a trivial equipment problem. It was a serious military event, but serious does not mean extraterrestrial. A nuclear command system can be vulnerable to many things. That was the Cold War reality. And in 1967, electromagnetic technology was not science fiction. The military was already deeply interested in electronic warfare, radar, jamming, signals intelligence, electromagnetic effects. Weapons systems were becoming increasingly dependent on electronics. A vulnerability in those systems could be strategically significant. So suppose for a moment that an unidentified electromagnetic disturbance had caused the missile failures. That would be extraordinary. But it would still not establish aliens. It could indicate technology, human technology, a classified test, an accidental interference, event, or an unknown natural phenomenon. And this is exactly why the UFO interpretation is both tempting and incomplete, because unidentified does not tell us what something was. It tells us what investigators did not know. There is another explanation that has been proposed. Mars. Skeptics have argued that at least some of the reported visual observations could have been caused by an astronomical object, particularly Mars, which was bright and visible in the sky during the period. That hypothesis does not explain every part of the broader story, but it demonstrates why the visual observations must be treated cautiously. A bright celestial object can appear stationary. Atmospheric conditions can make it seem to move. Distance can be difficult to judge at night, and observers who already believe they are seeing an aircraft can interpret unfamiliar movement through that expectation. None of this means trained military personnel cannot misidentify something. They can, everyone can. The real question is whether misidentification explains the timing of the missile malfunction. And here, we encounter the central problem. The official evidence establishes the malfunction. The witness accounts establish that some personnel later associated unusual aerial observations with the malfunction. But the evidence does not establish a causal connection between the two. That is the gap, and it is a very large gap, because correlation can be compelling, especially when the subject is nuclear weapons. Imagine two events occurring within minutes of each other. A strange object appears, a missile system fails, the human mind connects them immediately. But what if the object was unrelated? What if the missiles were already vulnerable? What if the object was simply Mars? What if the object was military technology? Or what if something genuinely unusual was happening in the sky and something genuinely unusual was happening inside the missile system at the same time? That last possibility is the one that keeps the case alive, not because it proves aliens, because the evidence never completely closes the loop, and then comes the second layer of the story. The reports did not exist in isolation. Other UFO sightings were being reported around Montana during this period. NICAP's chronology records multiple reports from Montana in early 1967, including reports of unusual luminous objects near Malta and other parts of the state. A March 24 report from the Belt area described a dome-shaped luminous object observed by a truck driver. Again, this does not prove a pattern. A UFO wave can be partly explained by heightened attention. One widely reported sighting can lead other people to reinterpret ordinary lights. The human tendency to see patterns is powerful, but the timing is difficult to ignore. 1967 was not a quiet year for UFO reports in the United States, and Montana had its own concentration of sightings. The state was also home to something uniquely sensitive, nuclear weapons, that makes every unidentified object around those facilities more consequential. The Air Force could not simply dismiss an unknown aircraft near a missile site, Even if it turned out to be a weather balloon, an aircraft, a planet, or a misidentified light, it still had to be investigated. That is one reason UFO stories around nuclear facilities are so persistent. The stakes are different. A strange light over a farm is one thing. A strange light over a nuclear weapons installation is another. And that leads to one of the most revealing details in the case. The military's concern does not necessarily prove what the object was, but it tells us something about what the military feared. Unknown objects around nuclear sites were security problems regardless of their origin. The Air Force had to know what they were. And when nuclear systems simultaneously malfunctioned, the situation became even more serious. There is a tendency in UFO narratives to treat secrecy itself as evidence. If the military classified something, the argument goes, it must have been extraterrestrial. But Cold War secrecy had many ordinary reasons. Nuclear weapons were secret. Missile vulnerabilities were secret. Electronic warfare capabilities were secret. Command and control weaknesses were secret. A malfunction in a nuclear launch system could be classified simply because admitting that it happened might reveal something dangerous about the system. So when a document disappears from public view, or a witness says he was told not to discuss something, that does not automatically establish a cover-up of alien contact. Sometimes secrecy protects technology, sometimes it protects mistakes, sometimes it protects national security, and sometimes secrecy creates the perfect environment for mythology. That may be one of the most important lessons of Malmstrom, because the story became larger with time. The original event was a technical failure. Then came witness recollections. Then UFO investigations, then books, then conferences, then documentaries, then claims that nuclear weapons had been deliberately disabled by extraterrestrial craft, and each retelling connected more pieces. But when we go backward instead of forward, something changes. The original evidence becomes smaller, the missile shutdown remains, the UFO connection becomes less certain, the claim of extraterrestrial involvement becomes even less certain, and the claim about gray aliens becomes particularly difficult to support. There is no reliable contemporary record establishing that a 1967 Malmstrom pilot encountered gray extraterrestrials, no verified alien body, no authenticated photograph of a gray being from the incident, no confirmed biological sample, no independently authenticated recording, no surviving piece of technology demonstrated to be extraterrestrial. There are stories, there are recollections, there are disputed reports, there are declassified documents, but those categories are not interchangeable, and perhaps the strangest part is that we do not need aliens to make this story disturbing, because the documented portion is already disturbing enough. 10 nuclear missiles went offline. The cause was serious enough to trigger a major investigation. The technical problem could be associated with an electrical signal or pulse, and the ultimate origin of that signal remained a problem for investigators. That is not a flying saucer story. It is a nuclear security story, and in some ways, that is more frightening, because an extraterrestrial explanation at least provides an identifiable enemy. An unknown technical vulnerability does not. Think about what the missile officers were responsible for. They were not guarding an ordinary weapons depot. They were part of a system designed to survive a nuclear war and retaliate. The entire architecture depended on reliability. The missiles had to launch when commanded. They had to remain secure when not commanded. The command system had to distinguish legitimate signals from everything else. If an external electrical event could cause multiple missiles to enter a no-go state, that represented a problem far more practical than flying saucers. It meant the system had a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities are exactly the kind of thing Cold War militaries did not want adversaries to know about. Now consider the UFO reports from another angle. Suppose the guards really did see something unusual. That still leaves several possibilities. Perhaps it was an aircraft. Perhaps an astronomical object, perhaps a classified military platform, perhaps a misperception, perhaps something that remains unidentified. But there is another question: why would anyone connect that observation to the missile failure? Because the timing was compelling, and because the witnesses were close to the system, that gives their testimony weight. But testimony is not the same as instrumentation. A person can honestly report what they experienced and still be wrong about what caused it. This distinction is often lost in UFO debates. Honesty and accuracy are not identical. A witness can be completely sincere. A trained officer can be completely sincere. A security guard can be completely sincere, and yet the explanation can remain uncertain. That is why the Malmstrom case survives, not because it proves one theory, because it resists a clean conclusion. The official explanation does not satisfy everyone. The UFO explanation lacks independent proof, and the surviving documentation sits somewhere between those positions. Then there is the question of Robert Salah's. His account became one of the defining narratives of the case. He described being underground. He described the call from security. He described a glowing object. He described missiles going offline. He later said he had been instructed not to discuss the incident. His story has been repeated for decades. But again, the documentary record does not independently establish every element of that account. The strongest documented missile shutdown occurred at Echo Flight. Salah's famous account concerns another flight and was reconstructed decades later. That means we should not casually combine them, and if we don't combine them, the story becomes more uncertain. But it also becomes more honest. There were real missile failures. There were real reports of unidentified objects. There were real investigations. There were former military witnesses who later came forward. There was disagreement about how those pieces fit together. That is enough. We don't need to manufacture a pilot. We don't need to invent gray aliens. We don't need a secret photograph. The mystery is already there. And it gets even more interesting when we consider what happened after the missiles went offline. The military did not respond as though aliens had attacked. It responded as though a weapons system had malfunctioned. Maintenance teams worked on the missiles. The system was restored. Investigators tried to determine what had happened. That response itself is revealing. Whatever personnel may have believed privately, the operational response was technical. Find the fault, restore the missiles, determine the cause, prevent recurrence. That is how a nuclear command organization behaves, and yet decades later, the same event would be remembered primarily as a UFO incident. How did that transformation happen? Part of the answer is time. People who had been silent for years began discussing what they remembered. Records became available through Freedom of Information requests. Researchers compared accounts. Discrepancies emerged. New interpretations appeared, and the story expanded. This is where historical memory becomes dangerous. A memory from 1967 is not a photograph. It changes. A person may remember the emotional intensity of an event more strongly than the exact date. A location may be confused. A sequence may be reconstructed. One person's memory can influence another person's. When researchers later compare several accounts, they may unintentionally create a cleaner narrative than the original event ever had. That does not make every witness unreliable. It means the historian has to ask a harder question: which parts of the story existed at the time, and which parts appeared later? That question is especially important with the gray alien element. The familiar image of the gray alien, large dark eyes, small mouth, thin body, humanoid shape became culturally dominant through later abduction narratives. But that imagery should not simply be projected backward onto every old UFO case. There is no solid evidence that the Malmstrom personnel described gray extraterrestrials in 1967. Their reported objects were generally described in terms of lights, shapes, colors, and motion. That difference matters. Because if we take a modern alien image and place it inside a 1967 event without evidence, we are no longer investigating history. We are rewriting it. And the real history is stranger precisely because it refuses to give us what we want. There is no clean monster, no definitive spacecraft, no final photograph. Instead, there is an electronic failure inside one of America's most important weapons systems. There are reports of unexplained lights. There are contradictory accounts. There are documents, there are memories, and there are gaps. The gap is where the mystery lives, but perhaps the most important question is not what the object was. It is whether the object had anything to do with the missiles at all. That is the question the evidence cannot conclusively answer. If the answer is no, then two unusual events happened in the same environment, a technical failure, and unidentified observations. That is possible. Coincidences happen. If the answer is yes, then something affected the missile system at the same time as an unidentified aerial phenomenon. But even then, something does not automatically mean extraterrestrial. It could mean electromagnetic interference. It could mean technology. It could mean an unknown natural phenomenon. It could mean something else entirely. And if the phenomenon was technological, then another question appears. Whose technology? America's? The Soviet Union's? Some secret project? Or something nobody understood? The Cold War makes that question especially uncomfortable, because in 1967, the United States and Soviet Union were engaged in an enormous technological competition. Both sides were developing surveillance systems. Both were developing electronic warfare. Both were trying to understand the other's capabilities. Both had reason to conceal unusual technology, and both had reason to investigate anything approaching strategic weapons. That means a mysterious object near a nuclear missile site did not need to be alien to be important. It only needed to be unknown. That word unknown is the one that keeps getting lost. A UFO is not necessarily a spacecraft. It is an observation without a satisfactory identification, and that is exactly where Malmstrom remains, unidentified, not proven extraterrestrial, not completely explained, not reducible to a single clean story. The March 16th incident remains the strongest foundation because the missile shutdown itself is documented. The UFO connection is much more contested. The later Salah's account adds another layer, but also introduces chronology and documentation problems, and the claims about gray aliens are weaker still. Once those layers are separated, the story becomes less sensational, but it also becomes more credible, and perhaps more unsettling, because now the central mystery is no longer, why did aliens come to Montana? It becomes, why did a nuclear missile system fail in a way that investigators struggled to explain, while personnel were simultaneously reporting unidentified activity nearby? And there is one final detail worth returning to. The missiles were not destroyed. They did not explode. They did not launch. They simply stopped being available for immediate strategic use. No go, a small phrase, an ordinary technical status. But imagine what it meant in that room. 10 nuclear weapons had gone from ready to unavailable. For the people responsible, that was not a philosophical mystery. It was a failure. And somewhere above them, according to later witness accounts, strange lights were being reported. The Air Force investigated. The system was repaired. The years passed. The Cold War ended. The witnesses grew older. Researchers returned to the documents, and the mystery became something else. A UFO legend, a government cover-up story. A story about extraterrestrials and nuclear weapons, but strip away every claim that cannot be demonstrated. Strip away the gray aliens. Strip away the assumption of extraterrestrial intent. Strip away the idea that every classified document must contain an alien secret. What remains is still difficult to dismiss: a real nuclear missile shutdown, a real military investigation, real witness testimony, real disagreement over what was seen, and a causal connection that has never been independently demonstrated. That last point is the most important, because there are two ways to tell this story. One is to begin with the conclusion: aliens appeared over Montana and shut down America's nuclear missiles. The second is to begin with what we actually know. 10 missiles went offline. Something caused them to do so. Personnel reported unusual aerial observations. The military investigated. The official record did not establish that the objects caused the malfunction. And decades later, witnesses offered accounts that challenged the official interpretation. That version leaves us with less certainty, but it also leaves us with a better mystery. Because the unanswered question is no longer buried beneath a mountain of mythology. It is sitting in plain sight. What happened inside those missile systems? And what, if anything, was happening in the sky above them? Maybe the answers are completely ordinary. Maybe the UFO reports were misidentifications. Maybe the missile failure was an obscure electrical problem. Maybe later memories connected events that were never connected at all. Or maybe there was a phenomenon in that Montana landscape that the people responsible for America's nuclear weapons did not understand. We cannot responsibly say which, and that uncertainty is not a weakness. In the story, it is the story. Because the most disturbing part of Malmstrom is not the possibility that something from somewhere else came looking for America's missiles. It is the possibility that, for a brief moment in March 1967, people entrusted with the most destructive weapons on Earth could not fully explain why those weapons stopped responding. and perhaps we've been asking the wrong question ever since, not whether something extraterrestrial came to Montana, but whether, for those few minutes beneath the ground, the people watching America's nuclear arsenal understood what was happening at all.